Yeah, it's no, you're not on drugs. It's cursors. Yeah, I mean, I know it's crazy.
To unlock this door,
All right, guys. I know there's a lot of cursors, but
beyond it
just
there's
bear with
another
me.
dimension. A dimension of sound, a dimension of
Yeah.
sight, a dimension of mind.
Yeah, my computer is hacked. Kramnik, when I got the pairings, it was a just a surreal moment. Now, I had played Kramnik in 2014, and I had played him in the London Chess Classic Rapid. I played him in a Rapid tournament in the final round, and I drew with the white pieces in a Berlin. So I drew him in a Rapid game. This was my first classical game against him in Qatar Masters. This was the strongest open tournament ever held. Magnus played in the 2016 edition. I also played there. And when I got the pairings the night before, I was like, holy frickin' smokes. And I posted on Facebook, and I could even trace that Facebook post. I posted something like, I was at that moment a freshman in Stanford. I was like, of all the essays I wrote, I'm pretty sure playing Kramnik with black is going to be harder. And not only was I playing Kramnik, I was playing him with black. And I was like, okay, I'm going to try my best, hunker down. He comes to the board. It's a surreal experience to just have him sit at the board. He's very intimidating. Kramnik is tall. He projects confidence. He's, there's something about these guys. You look at them from a distance, you're like, okay, they're just normal people. But when Kramnik comes to the board and he sits down, I'm like, okay, like this guy is serious. I need to play serious chess. And your hands just start shaking. So Kramnik starts with a ready, knight f3, d5. We transpose into a Grunfeld, which I had dabbled with. I'm mostly a King's Indian player, but I also play the Grunfeld sometimes, especially in classical chess. Bishop g7, and now Kramnik goes d4. So if white castles, he allows e5, and this is the reverse perk. And the reverse perk is just, I play this with white, but it's not dangerous for black. You can just go knight c6, and this is totally fine for black. So Kramnik is not about that stuff. He goes for the sort of more topical d4. And we get the symmetrical Grunfeld, fianchetto, c4. And I play d takes c4. The other move here is c6, just defending the pawn. There is a ton of theory here, and I will not get into it right now. There's just a ton of theory here. In terms of popularity, just so you guys know, c6, 5,000 games, d takes c4, 4,000 games. So both moves are very popular. And Kramnik goes knight to a3, essentially trying to recover the pawn. This is theory. Now I go c3. And the move c3, this is a very typical idea in these positions. Essentially, the logic behind this is I'm going to lose the pawn anyway, so I might as well give it up for something. I might as well ruin white's pawn structure a little bit. Again, I don't want to get into this too much. What is the difference between... This is kind of like a Catalan, right? And now I go c5, contesting the center, a very typical Grunfeld-esque move. Of course, taking the pawn would be a terrible idea because look at what white creates here. I mean, black can go knight e4. This is just horrible. And Kramnik goes knight e5. This is all theory. Knight c6 sacrifices a pawn. Still all theory. And the point of the sacrifice, without getting too deep, is that if white takes on c6, and this idea actually exists in a bunch of different lines, black develops with tempo bishop h3. And if you look at white's pieces, they're actually very awkward. So this is a big initiative that black develops here. People don't really play like this anymore. And Kramnik goes knight a to c4, which is the main move. And here's the funny thing. I go knight d5. This is all theory. Takes, takes. This position was familiar to me. And the only move that was familiar to me was bishop b2, which at the time this game was played, 2015. And it sounds weird to say that phrase at the time this game was played, but times have really changed in 5 years. I mean, that's crazy to say, but it's true. Bishop b2 was back then the main move. Kramnik, after a 1-minute think, plays the move bishop d2. And pardon my French, but when he played this move, I was like, oh shit. Because two things came through my mind. The first was, I don't know this move. Kramnik has just made a move that I don't know. That's not good. Second thing that came through my mind, wait a minute, I can take his pawn. This is probably some sort of crazy preparation. Kramnik is playing crazy preparation against me with the white pieces. I am screwed. And essentially that was exactly the truth of the matter. The funny thing is in the post-game interview, which Kramnik gave, I can show you guys, but it's not that interesting. He essentially said something like, okay, no, well, I looked a little bit at some old analysis. My seconds had prepared for me this move, 5 years ago. I don't know really very much about it. I only studied it for like 4 weeks for Daniel, So this was some old analysis that his team had prepared for him, which he sort of uncorked at this game, which I was like, all right, Vlad. Well, I don't have a goddamn team, all right? I know you only looked at this for 5 minutes, but great. Now, was this a novelty? This was not technically a novelty. It was played in 2008. It was played a couple of times, in fact, before my game, by players who were not very famous. Kramnik was the first well-known player to play this, and here's the hilarious thing. After Kramnik, this move was repeated later in the same tournament by David Howell, 2700 GM from England. It was repeated in 2016 and 17 by 2700 plus rated players. So he literally sets trends. Kramnik plays something, all of these GMs who already play this opening, they frickin' turn their heads and they repeat his lines. I mean, that is essentially the power of being someone like Kramnik. You get to set the tone for what is played. Okay? So let's unpack exactly why taking the pawn is a bad idea here. And this has happened a couple of times. The move is actually just rook c1. And the idea, if I can explain it in simple terms, there's two ideas. First, look at this bishop. We actually transpose into a game that was played in 1973. This bishop is undefended, which means white has a bunch of discovered attacks on the cards. Number two, this pawn on c6 is very weak, and if white picks it off like this, don't forget about this g2 bishop. That could really strike deeply into black's position. So this is actually super dangerous for black. The computer, let's see what the computer says. The computer says that black is slightly worse. Yeah, so this is actually very high quality analysis. And black actually is much worse here. He's got to be very careful just not to be losing. It's just hard to find a move. If you just drop the bishop back, for example, then after knight a5, it's already plus minus. You have to give this up. Well, and this is just totally nasty with that bishop operating uncontested. So I detected all of this, and I actually played a reasonable move here. I played bishop a6, which later came to be known as the main move. So I really tried this game, and Kramnik goes knight to e5. And okay, so I can take the knight, but I really don't want to do that because that would mean giving up my fianchettoed bishop, and look at these holes around the king. So I wouldn't want to do that unless there was a good reason. So I went queen d6, defending the d6 pawn and potentially putting pressure on the knight. So I think that the best move in this position was later determined to be queen to c7. This is a line that has happened several times since then, and I think you're supposed to now take the knight. Black has a path to equality, which is very narrow, which I, of course, was not aware of at the time. It's a computerish line. I don't want to look at it. I went queen d6, and Kramnik goes rook e1. And this is just so deep, typical Kramnik type of chess. Why does he go rook e1? Well, he unpins the pawn, okay? And so the idea is if I take on e5 twice, then he's got several things at his disposal. He no longer has to worry about defending the pawn. So his move here would have been queen to c1, okay? Essentially defending this pawn, preparing c4, bishop c3, and preparing stuff like bishop h6. So rook e1 is in effect a prophylactic move, okay? Just liberating the queen from the responsibility of defending e2. One advice that I have for you guys is the queen should not be doing menial tasks on the chessboard. If you find that your queen is tied down to a pawn, that's not usually a good thing. It's sometimes worthwhile to hand off responsibility to a piece of lesser value, such as the rook or the bishop, so that the queen could be doing bigger and greater things, if that makes sense. This is not a dogma, but it's just an idea. Hopefully this helps you guys at least a little bit. Now, in this position, I thought for like 20 minutes. I took the pawn. In this position, I thought for like 20 minutes. I couldn't decide, do I take the knight, do I not? And I finally decided to take the knight, which was actually a very reasonable decision. I simply win a pawn, and in return, Kramnik gets he gets rid of my fianchettoed bishop, which obviously is a very serious positional gain for white. And the question now becomes, well, who is better here? Does white have enough compensation for the pawn? The answer is yes. He has not only enough compensation, black is the one who's got to be very careful here. This has happened 4 times since my game. And actually, according to the computer, well, it's hard for black to even equalize. The move rook a d8 is the actual equalizing move according to my analysis. And the idea is essentially to prepare c takes d4, followed by c5, undermining the knight. But to find all of this in a classical game over the board would be really hard. And Akash says exactly what I thought, okay? Exactly what I was thinking, which is that the dark squared weaknesses, I realized that I was giving up my bishop, but I didn't think that, okay, my king was going to get under such a big attack. And he doesn't have any pieces on the king side, okay? And I didn't fully appreciate how many ideas white in fact does have. And what Kramnik does the next 20 moves is going to be frickin' incredible, okay? So just buckle up, and I'm going to try my best to explain his moves. He starts with rook c1, very understandable. He just brings his rook in, and he attacks c6, to which I respond rook f to d8, which I think is actually a very good move. And this, I think, is a novelty. Yeah, so there was one other game that went rook f c8. I didn't want to tie my rook down to the defense of the pawn. So what is my idea? I was really hoping that Kramnik would take, and I had calculated a really nice line here. Let me try to remember what it was. There was some sort of drawish line here that went, I think, bishop b7. Yes, I remember. And if rook c1, then there was some like knight c3 related idea. Or maybe I just go rook b8. And essentially, it's actually good for me that the pawn is gone, because now my own bishop is contesting the long diagonal. Okay? So there was some reason that taking is bad. Again, I don't want to delve too deeply into these technicalities. Kramnik goes queen to c2. He gets his queen out of the x-ray. And I go rook a to c8. Now, if I had gone bishop b5, he can simply chase the bishop away with a4. So unfortunately, the bishop doesn't hold on. I go rook c8. I defend the pawn. Yeah, there is a knight e3 idea. Yeah. Oh, that was the idea, actually, I think. Yes, that's exactly right. Chess lover, beautiful. That was my idea. Knight e3 takes, bishop takes g2, and now queen d5 picks off the bishop, and I'm actually better here because of his ruined pawn structure. So I actually played a really, really good game, and I'm proud of the way that I played. Kramnik just played an incredible game. So I defend the pawn. Kramnik goes queen to c5, tightening the pressure. He's putting his queen here. He's attacking a7. And he's creating a threat against black's queen. What is actually white's threat here? If it were white to move, what would he do specifically? And hint, hint, he is not going to take on a7. What is he going to do? Man, I could do this all day. We still got, how many viewers do we have? Just because I don't have chat open in the way that I normally do. We have 7:56 at 5 a.m. Incredible. So big shout out before I proceed to the analysis, everybody who supports. I hope you guys are enjoying. It's different from what I normally do, but I mean, I hope that people are having a good time. I certainly am. And once again, I appreciate people participating, and just, it's an awesome community. So thank you guys. Let's proceed. He's threatening e4. He's threatening e4, and he's going to win the knight because I can't move the knight. The queen's undefended. So I go queen to d6. And again, I came up with what I think is a really nice idea. If he takes on a7, I go c5. I trap his queen. I'm threatening rook c7 to win the queen. And if he takes my knight, I will take his bishop. If he takes my bishop, I take his bishop, and it's a draw. I mean, we bail out, it's a draw, and gee, drawing Kramnik with black, not the worst thing in the world. So I was hoping he would do this. Spoiler alert, Kramnik doesn't do it. He goes queen a5. So what's instructive about the way he plays here is he doesn't mind being down a pawn. He goes for the long-term initiative. He doesn't try to win the pawn immediately. Thank you, Bangtown, California. Thank you so much for the 500 bits, keeping me going with some energy. Always appreciate it. And he's attacking the bishop. And if I move my bishop back, well, then he's going to take the pawn because now he's attacking the bishop as well. So I go c5, extending the defense on the bishop. If he takes my knight, again, what really helps me here is the fact that his bishop is unprotected. So he takes mine, I take his. Again, we have a mass petering out, and we have a draw. So Bishop h3 is what Kramnik does here. A very, very good move. So let me try to explain this move. 123 from Jacob. Thank you. The move bishop h3 accomplishes a couple of things. It unfiancheros the bishop, which may make it seem very unnatural, right? You normally don't want to leave g2 with the bishop. But he's unsettling my position, right? He's sort of forcing a concession of some sort. Because whatever I do, I'm going to weaken my position. If I move the rook away, I'm going to give up c5. I didn't want to give up c5. If I move my rook to c7, you guys can probably see that this creates some very unwelcome tension. And he can actually probably just go e4 and then go bishop f4 and stuff like that. I mean, I didn't want to allow it. If I go rook c6, then the queen is overloaded. The queen is tasked now with defending the rook. Didn't want to do that either. So I go e6. But, so why not rook c6? Maybe I should have gone rook c6. Why specifically, I guess, is the question. I think I didn't want to allow something like rook c to d1, and now bishop f4 becomes a big threat because the queen is going to have to be tied down to the defense of the rook. Thank you, Jacobski21 for the tier 1. Appreciate it. And so I go e6, which is the same move in spirit. f5 would be too weakening. Okay, f5 would create what's called a hook on the king side, which he would exploit with the move e4. So I play e6, which also weakens. What exactly does this weaken, guys? And how does white exploit this weakness? Kramnik's next move exploits directly the weakness created by the move e6. And this is what makes this play so aesthetically pleasing. Every single move builds on top of the previous one. It weakens f6. How does white exploit f6? That's exactly right. It weakens f6. Okay, mushroom. I'm feeling generous. Either participate. Yep, all right. Dark squares. How does he exploit it? Bishop g5 is exactly right. Attacking the rook. Contesting the square. And if I go f6, we saw this in my game against Ortiz. Kramnik counterstrikes with e4. I didn't do this. If the knight moves, bishop f6. If I take, he takes, and my position just collapses because e6 is going to fall with check, and everything here just collapses. So I can't do that. Okay. I move my rook away. Fine. But now Kramnik continues to put pressure. He goes rook c, oops, he goes rook cd1. And again, he creates a threat. This time, the threat is to play e4 and exploit the pin. So I'm like, damn, where do I go? Because if I go queen b6, trying to trade queens, this is my initial intention. I didn't like this, even though this is a very tempting move. And the reason I didn't like this, I think, is because after queen a3, essentially, the knight is the only piece now defending f6, right? And if he goes e4, do you guys see a potential lobster pincer mate in the works? So look at this. e4, bishop f6, and then queen e3 and queen h6. And he's got a lobster pincer mate. And all of a sudden, do you guys remember when I took his knight? And I was like, look at my king is perfectly safe. What's up, queen? My king is perfectly safe. Nothing's happening. All of a sudden, we're talking lobster pincer mate 10 moves later, such as the power of Kramnik. Okay? So I don't do that. I go queen e5, another good move. So I find a way to get the bishop out of g5. Because if he takes my bishop, I take his. We've seen that as a theme. And he has no way to defend this bishop with tempo. If he goes f4, that weakens his own king. I go queen e3 check. And so Kramnik, and this is another thing that makes him amazing, is he's able to be, again, we talked about flexibility. White's already better. And I beat back the first wave of attack, but that doesn't mean he doesn't mount a second one. He goes bishop d2. Now, this seems like a concession. It seems like Kramnik is admitting the failure of his strategy, but he's actually not. He's just gearing up for the second stage of the attack. So why is the bishop on d2? Well, notice, first of all, that he's now actually attacking my bishop. My bishop doesn't have that many good squares. If I go to b7, he can still take on a7. If I take on e2, well, this is just suicide after bishop f1, clearly. And there's just no good squares. There's no good way to defend the bishop either. And his bishop is preparing to potentially reroute to c3. And if it reroutes to c3, it has exactly the same effect that it would have on f6. It's just x-raying, sizzling on that diagonal, and it's going to create mating ideas. I didn't like that. So I go queen to h5. I try to counterattack again the other bishop and create an attack on the e2 pawn. So if he drops it back to its fianchettoed square, I take on e2. This time I can do this. And then I bring my own bishop on f3. But what does Kramnik do? And this is like such a typical Kramnik move. He doesn't care how his moves look. He only cares what his moves do. And this is something we can all learn from, including myself. I tend to fall in love with moves that kind of make a lot of noise. But look at Kramnik's next move. I want you guys to find it. Yeah, bishop f1. Just drops his bishop back. And he defends e2. And he knows that the bishop is not going to stay on f1 forever. Piece placement is dynamic. Piece placement is temporary. Finally, I have to bring my bishop back. I have failed. If I go rook c6, which I think I considered, and let me verify with the computer, full disclosure. Yes, so rook c6 would have probably been a better move. Sorry, not h3. And no, actually bishop b7 is the best. I'll tell you guys later where exactly my mistake was. The best move, according to the computer, actually just is h3. And the queen is almost trapped. I think what I didn't like about this, guys, is that my rook is now tied down to the bishop, right? And I just wanted to get rid of the tension. I wanted to say, okay, I'm going to give up a pawn. I don't care, but at least my pieces are a little bit more free, okay? So I go rook c7. I'm actually playing all computer moves this entire game. And I'll tell you guys where I falter. He drops his queen back. Now material is equal. I go rook a8. And basically what I got in return for the pawn, at least my rook is active. My bishop is on the long diagonal. My pieces are a little bit stable. And finally, my next move was a mistake. I had played perfectly up to this point, perfectly. My next move was a mistake. What should I have done? I could have actually kept equality had I realized that black essentially has only one big asset in this position. And this asset is the c-pawn. And I need to push it as quickly as possible. And I did realize that, but I didn't push it in the right way. That is all it takes to lose to Kramnik, is that kind of mistake. I should have gone bishop a6 and simply pushed this pawn for all that it's worth, c4 and c3. And the knight is used as a protector of the rook and as a supporter of the c-pawn. But I thought of it in a different way. As you guys can probably understand, I wanted the bishop to remain on b7 because I wanted it to control the long diagonal. I thought that was important. So instead, I went knight b6. And my idea was exactly the same. Queen c1, c4, I started to push the pawn. The problem here is twofold. First of all, c3 is going to be harder to achieve. And second of all, the problem is I completely forgot about the dark squares around my king. I just didn't realize that the knight was doing an incredibly good job at protecting some of these squares, at holding things together. And all of a sudden now, the floodgates have opened and Kramnik rushes in with unbelievable vigor. Where does he go? And he returns back to a square from which I had rudely kicked him out. Now he comes back to this square. This is what makes this game absolutely beautiful. Bishop c3 is the right idea, but there is a better way of accomplishing it, which is what? We've seen that move before. We've seen this move before. Not bishop c3. Bishop c3 maybe allows knight back to d5, and I can pressure his bishop. Bishop g5. Bishop g5. Now, notice, guys, a lot of you are suggesting bishop h6, but this is not a good move. Why? Because notice that the bishop on h6 is, again, I remember I told you don't always make your queen do menial tasks. Here, the queen is essentially tasked with defending the bishop. So the queen is not going to have the mobility necessary to maneuver, let's say, to f6. Now, you might be saying, but wait a second, isn't it the same situation here? Well, it's not really the same situation because the queen can still come to f4, but the bishop has access to all of these squares on this diagonal. I go queen g4. The reason I go queen g4 is because I was actually afraid of in addition to everything else, the idea of h3 followed by g4, and my queen is frickin' trapped. So I was like, I need to get my queen the hell out of there. Now Kramnik does absolute wizardry. White to play and introduce even further strain in black's position, using this bishop not only as a tool to occupy squares, but also as a tactical weapon, exploiting my pieces being on the same diagonal. Boom! Look at this move, and look at this play. He's doing everything. The bishop is a hero in his hands. It's attacking the rook. It's skewering the rook to the knight. My move is forced. I have to go rook c6. But wait a second. Look where the rook has ended up. Do you guys see why this could be a problem? Not only am I blocking the bishop, I'm going under the ire of the bishop. And now Kramnik goes h3. He chases my queen away. And guess what he does now? The bishop on d8 has done its job. If he goes bishop g2, and this is also what makes Kramnik so great, he was patient. If he goes bishop g2, that wouldn't be good because I go knight d5. And I attack his bishop. Samith, what's up? Bishop back to g5. Look at this. Bishop back to g5. Okay, no problem. I mean, simply okay. You know, accumulate the advantages. Okay. Bishop back to g5. And again, he's threatening to trap my queen. And again, he's straining my position, forcing me to chase that bishop away with rook c5. Now the rook is in an even more vulnerable square. And finally, Kramnik goes bishop f6, parks the bishop on this diagonal. I go queen f5. Again, I have to chase it away from there. Otherwise, he's going to lobster pincer mate me. He's going to lobster pincer mate me with g4. Actually, the queen is actually just trapped here. I mean, and after he takes my queen, he's going to lobster pincer mate me. So I have to chase the bishop away. Guess where the bishop now goes? And this is why he's forced my rook onto c5. Now he can play with tempo. What move does he play? Boom. Bishop d4 with tempo. Rook b5. I have to slide my rook and keep the knight protected. And here comes e4. Attacking my queen. Now what if I take the pawn on e4? Why does this work? What does Kramnik do? Here he had a brilliant idea. And it involves, of all pieces, the rook on a8. He takes on b6. White to play and win material. Rook takes e4. Queen takes e4. Bishop g2. Pinning the queen to the rook. I have to move my queen, and he simply takes the rook, and he is up a piece. I mean, can you believe this level of tactical vision? He notices things that I would never notice in a million years, such as the rook on a8 playing a role in this game. Now, e4 looks like an odd move because it allows queen f3. But finally, the bishop, which has sat on f1 so patiently the entire game, returns to g2 and kicks the queen away again. If I come to h5 with the queen, again, we are familiar. He goes g4. This is no good. I have to go around to a3. And now the final three moves of the game are what's going to get you off of your frickin' chairs. What's crazy about Kramnik's play this entire game is how flexible it's been. He's done all sorts of stuff. But now it's how quickly he redirects his attention from the king side to winning material. One of the greatest assets, one of the greatest strengths of GMs, super GMs like Kramnik, is their ability to be doing something for the entire game. And whenever they see a chance to win material, in the snap of a finger, they change their entire approach. Queen h6 would be the tempting move. But it's not good because I can go e5 and I can intercept the bishop's control over the diagonal. But Kramnik takes. And rook b1. And he wins a piece. Because look at my knight on b6 and my bishop on b7. Both of them are unprotected. Both of them are under fire. I have to do something with this rook and he's going to skewer me. If I go rook a5 to try to protect my rook, he simply takes the knight. And the rook x-ray defends the bishop. I took, and I'm losing a piece. I went c3, and now Kramnik goes bishop takes b6, winning a knight. In this position, I resigned out of respect. Normally I would play longer, but because it's Kramnik, I resigned. It is completely losing. And some of you may be like, wait a second, don't I have this strong pawn? Well, the pawn in and of itself is nothing, right? It's just going to be easily picked up. The easiest plan for white is just to bring the king over to d3 and take on c2, and he's going to be up a full piece. Again, against somebody else, I would have played this out for longer, but against Kramnik, it had been an honor to play him, and he deserved my resignation. The position is simply losing. We talked for 5 minutes after the game. He explained some of his ideas. And this might have been the happiest I've ever been after a loss. I normally don't take, who does take losses well? This was a classical game, Qatar Masters Open. This might have been the most highest on life I've ever been in Russian after a loss. Because I had not only the privilege and honor of playing him, but he played one of, I would say, his greatest games against me. He played like a 2900. And this was incredible. I think I played my heart out. I really made only one mistake. My one mistake was to move the knight away from d5. I mean, all of this was good. This move knight b6, what it did was that it gave him too many of these squares. Yeah, we analyzed in Russian, and then he went to the press conference with Svidler. He talked about the game there. I basically incorporated everything that he said there into my analysis here. You can take a look at it. You can YouTube search it. And that basically was my game against Kramnik. I've also written a chess.com article on my game against Kramnik on this game. It's called Anatomy of a Brilliancy, and I analyze this game in great detail. And I don't want to like overhype things, but in my opinion, this was one of the few times when I experienced firsthand just absolute legendary play. And honestly, this was just something to behold.